Okay, so let's deal with a lighter topic this week. Evidence for God's existence. Just kidding about the light topic part, not the God part. Because I actually think that there is compelling evidence for the existence of God. And while people use different avenues to provide evidence, the most compelling one for me is a quick analysis of Jewish history. What I'd like to do is to show you 5 phenomena which have taken place in Jewish history. Things that any objective historian would agree are unprecedented, remarkable, and extremely unlikely. And then I would like to show you how each of these phenomena were explicitly promised and foreseen in the Hebrew Bible. My argument is that only a being unbound by time would have had the foresight to make these predictions. Only a God could have done so. Phenomena number 1. The survival of the Jewish people over the last 3,000 years. We take it for granted that there are still Jews around, but consider all the ancient peoples that existed at the same time as the ancient Israelites and are now extinct: the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Jebusites. But it's not just ancient peoples. Even the greatest empires and nations, often those that actually tried to persecute the Jews, have died while the Jews remain. If you would have gone up to a Roman imperialist 2,000 years ago and asked him, who do you think is more likely to be around in 2,000 years' time? Your imperialist nation, the Romans, or the Jewish people? He would have laughed at you. In his essay on the Jews, Mark Twain noted that the Egyptian, the Babylonian, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans all enjoyed their moment in the spotlight in history. But they now sit, quote, in twilight, and yet the Jew remains. What is the secret of his immortality? He asked. Leo Tolstoy said, the Jew is the emblem of eternity. Historians are in fascination at the continued survival of the Jewish people, while so many other tribes and peoples and empires and nations have faded away. Now let's have a look at what the Torah says about Jewish survival. God says, just as I am God and I do not change, so too you, the children of Jacob, shall never be wiped out. Number 2. Worldwide exile. Throughout most of Jewish history, the Jewish people have been scattered across the globe. There are Jews on all 5 continents, and Jews are constantly on the move. What's so interesting is that while the Jews are one of the oldest peoples in the world, in terms of the countries they currently occupy, they are actually one of the youngest, because Jews are always moving around. Sociologists will tell you that if you want to assimilate a people, if you want to get rid of them, then scatter them and they will disappear. And yet, despite worldwide exile, the Jewish people have remained. All this clearly foreseen in the Torah. And yet, despite this grave threat of global exile, the Torah remains convinced of Jewish survival. Number 3. Few in number. The total number of Jews in the world has never exceeded 16 million, and rarely exceeded 1% of total world population. This is particularly remarkable because at one point, millennia ago, the Jewish people were about the same in population as the Han Dynasty of China, about 12 million. Yet today the Chinese population is 1.3 billion, according to the most recent census. Give or take about 14 million. Well, 14 million is the entire number of the Jewish people. And today, there are fewer Jews than there were before the Holocaust. Now, obviously our small population can be explained partly by the high levels of persecution, but our tiny size, coupled with worldwide dispersion, makes our survival even more remarkable. And the Torah clearly states, "And you shall remain few in number among the nations where God shall lead you." Number 4. Anti-Semitism. Something which has baffled historians for 4 key reasons. Its longevity, its universality, its intensity, consider the long list of words created specifically to describe Jew hatred, and its irrationality. Just consider the reasons given for hating Jews. They're money-grabbing capitalists, but also revolutionary communists. They're parasites on other nations' societies. And when they have their own states, they're militant occupiers of a land not their own. No historian has been able to find a consistent reason to explain anti-Semitism throughout history. A common explanation for prejudice given by sociologists is the dislike of the unlike. That if a group of people can manage to assimilate, they will no longer face persecution. Yet, when the Jewish people assimilate, such as in Germany, where they declared, "Berlin is our Jerusalem," they eventually faced the most intense persecution ever seen in modern history. The Nazis declared, "Stop trying to become like us and infiltrating our race." Anti-Semitism is totally irrational. And once again, the Torah clearly forewarns the Jewish people of the persecution that they will face in exile. So the Torah forewarned global exile, being few in number, and intense persecution, an unprecedented recipe for national extinction. And yet the Torah remained convinced that the Jewish people will survive. But we're not done yet. Number 5, the remarkable impact of Judaism on the world. When I was at college studying history, we were asked by our lecturer who we thought was the most influential human being in all of human history. I think it's pretty easy to make the case that this man was Abraham. Just think about this. The majority of the world today believe in the God of Abraham. The majority of the world is made up of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Yet 3,000 years ago, in Abraham's time, or even 2,000 years ago, the majority of the world was polytheistic or pagan, believing in many gods. What's even more remarkable is that Abraham was a man with no army, no empire to command, no political power, and nearly everyone was against him. And yet somehow, the author of the Torah was convinced, thousands of years ago, that one day the world would look to Abraham as their spiritual forefather. God tells Abraham, "I will bless you and make your name great, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." But it's more than monotheism that Judaism brought to the world. Many of the world's values that the world holds dear today were first articulated by the Bible. The value of human life, the importance of family, peace as an ideal, justice and equality, social responsibility and education. These were not concepts that were given much credibility 2,000 years ago. The Jews were looked down upon for upholding them. War was glorified by the Romans. The Greeks practiced promiscuity as an ideal. The poor were blamed for their own misfortune. People's social status defined their rights. John Adams, the second president of America, said, quote, "I will insist that the Hebrews have contributed more to civilized men than any other nation. If I were an atheist, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations." Now surely, if the Jewish people are going to be small in number, how could they make such a worldwide impact? And if they are hated, who's going to listen to them? And if the Jews really are looked up to, wouldn't others want to join them? Does it make sense that the Jewish people have had such an impact? The very fact that they have survived is eye-opening in and of itself, but they have also thrived in the global conversation of ideas. All this clearly foreseen when Isaiah prophesies that Israel would be the light unto the nations. Somehow, despite being intensely persecuted, small in number, and dispersed all over the globe, the Jewish people have managed to survive while countless empires have come and gone. And despite all these setbacks, Judaism has influenced mankind in an astonishing way. Now, if all of these events had simply occurred without being foretold, I would be willing to say, you know what? All of this is pretty remarkable, but maybe it was just a fluke. Maybe the Jews got lucky. Or alternatively, if the predictions were based on normal historical processes, then I would say that the writers of the Torah were probably human and were simply making educated guesses. But the problem is that all of these predictions are totally extraordinary, not following any of the rules of the history of nations. In my mind, the only reasonable option we have is that the author of the Torah must have been a being that is not bound by time, a being that transcends time, God. Blaise Pascal, the founder of probability theory, someone who had a thing or two to say about making a decision on what is most probable, was asked by King Louis XIV of France for proof of God's existence. And Pascal responded, "The Jews, Your Majesty, the Jews."
Imagine if I told you that there is a certain area of land in the world where its fertility is dependent upon the people that dwelled in that land. That would seem pretty preposterous, right? Agriculture doesn't work like that. Either a land is fertile or it isn't. It doesn't depend on which group of people inhabits the land. Can land really have some kind of direct relationship with the people living on it? Well, I have some news for you. Such a relationship does exist, and it's between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. Let me explain. When the Jewish people entered the land, even up until the time of Josephus, i.e. approximately 1300 years later, it was still very prosperous and fertile. Josephus wrote, "For the whole area is excellent for crops or pasturage, and rich in trees of every kind, so that by its fertility it invites even those least inclined to work on the land. In fact, every inch of it has been cultivated by the inhabitants, and not a parcel goes to waste. It is thickly covered with towns, and thanks to the natural abundance of the soil, the many villages are so densely populated that the smallest of them has more than 15,000 inhabitants. Indeed, according to the Torah, when entering the land, the Jews are told, 'God will bring you to a good land, a land flowing with streams and springs gushing out in the valley and the mountains. It is a land where you shall not eat your bread in rations.' But then they are also warned that if they mess up, God says, 'I will devastate the land, and your enemies who dwell in it will be desolate. You I will scatter among the nations at the point of my drawn sword, and your land will be completely desolate, and your cities will be in ruins.'" The basic idea is this. As long as the Jews are in the land of Israel, the land will be very fertile. However, as soon as a majority of the Jewish people leave the land or are expelled from the land, it's going to become desolate and inhospitable to all others who try to live there. Now, obviously, no scientist could ever begin to explain how a plot of land could only flourish for one particular people. But that's exactly what happened. No one living at that time 2,000 years ago would have been able to see how their blossoming land could suddenly turn desolate and remain so as long as Jews stayed in foreign lands. But exactly as predicted, 2,000 years ago the Jewish people were oppressed and exiled from their land by the Roman Empire. And so, what happened to the land's fertility? During the 2,000 years that the Jewish people were exiled, many empires and nations conquered its territory, and countless wars were fought for its possession. Indeed, the land is situated on the Fertile Crescent where 3 continents meet, a prime location for nations and empires to acquire. And yet, astonishingly, no conqueror succeeded in permanently settling there or in causing this desolate wasteland to blossom. Remarkably, the land became and remained desolate, despite all the odds. The medieval Jewish scholar Nachmanides, the Ramban, wrote in a letter to his son in 1260, quote, "The desolation is great. The more sacred the place, the more it has suffered." Mark Twain said on his visit to the land in 1867 that it is a desolate country whose soil is rich enough but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. Has this ever happened anywhere else in the world? The Europeans came to the US and took it over from the American Indians. Did the land's fertility suddenly change? No. If a land is fertile, it's fertile. If it's a desert, it's a desert. Not so with the land of Israel. Only there does the land become uninhabitable when the Jews are exiled. Obviously, we can see in hindsight how nation after nation squabbled over the land and never made it blossom. But how could anyone be bold enough to predict such an occurrence? How could they know in advance that it would happen? Why would they write that in their book? What guarantees do they have that it would happen? None. Now, remarkably, after many years of exile, the Torah states that the Jewish people will eventually return to the land of Israel, and with their return will be the miraculous physical rejuvenation of this desolate land. Quote, "And God will return your captured ones, and he will have compassion upon you, and he will gather you in from all the nations that God scattered you there." While Jews always maintained a presence in the land while most of their brethren were in exile, from the end of the 19th century, Jews began to return in large waves to the land of Israel. And by 1948, the State of Israel was declared a reality. This was an unprecedented event in human history. What other nation has returned to its land after such a long period of dispersion, minority population, and persecution? We are all witnesses to the fact that in less than 1 generation, the land of Israel has undergone an unbelievable transformation, from a desolate wasteland into a prosperous and blossoming land. Israel is a large exporter of fruits and vegetables around the world today. Israel has gone from a negligible population to about half the Jews in the world and counting. From the colonies of countless empires to a secure homeland for Jews across the world to return to. It's amazing. The land has responded to her people. Who could have predicted that such a phenomenon would take place? How could someone know 3,000 years ago that the land of Israel would only respond to the Jewish people? That when they leave the land en masse, its fertility will suddenly fall, despite nation after nation attempting to acquire it? And only when the Jews return will it finally become fertile again. Could such a human being take a risk by making this prophecy in the Torah? What if they got it wrong? What if some other nation did rebuild the land? To me, the history of the land of Israel's relationship with her people is testimony to the divine hand over human affairs. Today we are witness to an ancient prophecy becoming manifest. We are witness to what I personally think can only be described as the hand of God. Before we end, let me show you a quote from Professor Sir John William Dawson in his book Modern Science in Bible Lands. He said this in 1888. He said, quote, "Until today, no people has succeeded in establishing national dominion in the land of Israel. No national unity or spirit of nationalism has acquired any hold there. The mixed multitude of itinerant tribes that managed to settle there did so on lease, as temporary residents. It seems that they await the return of the permanent residents of the land." I'm Ollie Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV. If someone tells you that they have faith in God, what does that mean? Most people would tell you that faith is something beyond the realms of logic. The dictionary defines faith as belief in something for which there is no proof. Do people actually still use these books? We often hear the phrases blind faith or a leap of faith, implying that faith means belief despite sufficient evidence. If that is the case, then what intellectual value does faith have? And on the other hand, if faith is considered to be based on logic, then why call it faith at all? The whole concept of faith in Jewish thinking is very different to the conventional Western understanding. Translating the Hebrew word Emunah as faith, which is its conventional meaning, is far off from Jewish thought. The medieval commentator, the Rambam Maimonides, says it is a mitzvah, a commandment to know that God exists. He is supposed to be knowable through intellectual reasoning. So if that is true, what do we mean when we say Emunah? Does it mean faith in the way it is understood in the modern world? Clearly not. Ask yourself, are your decisions based on your intellect or your emotion? The answer is it's always a mix of both. For example, someone who breaks a diet 2 days after starting just to taste the dessert is choosing 1 minute of short-term pleasure over the longer-term goal of being healthy and fit and losing weight. But this sort of behavior is typical. Cognitive dissonance, as it is sometimes phrased, allows us to do what we know full well is wrong because of the short-term pleasure we feel by doing it. The concept of Emunah does not contradict the idea that one can have knowledge of God. Emunah doesn't mean to believe in something despite the evidence. Rather, it means to be loyal to the evidence despite your physical or emotional impulses to do otherwise. Emunah really means faithfulness or trustworthiness. It means being loyal to the truth. Just as you can know donuts are bad for you but ignore the consequences, you can have knowledge of God and ignore the consequences. This is what is meant when the Torah says, "You shall know this day and take it to your heart." Know means to use intellectual reasoning, while take it to your heart means to live with what you know to be true. Imagine God spoke to you and asked you to do a favor for him. Anyone would jump at the opportunity. Anything you want, God. So God says, all right, tomorrow morning I want you to go to the top of a skyscraper in your city and jump off it. But don't worry, I'll be sure to catch you. Would you do it? You know that God's going to catch you. But when you get to the top of that skyscraper, you're going to have a moment of hesitation. You can know full well that God said he would catch you, but transferring that knowledge into action is the difficulty. In Judaism, we start with knowledge, but once we have that knowledge, we are taken on a journey which requires belief. When God appears to Abraham, he says, "Go for yourself to the land that I will show you." God makes his presence clear to Abraham, but he doesn't tell Abraham where the destination is. Similarly, during the 40 years that the Jewish people were in the desert, they would often be told to move to a different location, but they didn't know where they were going and for how long they would be there. Though God's presence was blatantly manifest from all the miracles that they experienced, they were now required to put trust in God. And so too in our own lives, we are expected to be able to clarify our beliefs and commit to a godly life through reason. But the ordeal is to hold on to those convictions when the roller coaster of life pushes us to question if God is really out there, guiding our lives. Most religions say you can never know, but you can believe. In Judaism, we say you certainly can know, but the real challenge is to believe. I'm Ollie Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV.
It's one of the greatest questions a person can ask. If there's a God, and God is good, why is there suffering in the world? Most people find themselves asking this question at some point in their lives, and there can be no doubt, life can sometimes get really dark. What I want to do is to suggest some Jewish approaches for how we can begin to understand this difficult question. Some approaches may only be applicable to certain situations. Some may speak to you and some may not. But hopefully they can provide some perspective on dealing with this difficult question. The first approach can be best explained with a story. There's a little baby toddler that has been given a big bouncy ball for his birthday. This ball is everything to him. He's playing with it every day. One day his mother accidentally leaves the front door open, and this little boy pushes the ball out of the front door and into the road. He chases after the ball, and as he begins to approach the road, his mother notices what is going on, and she grabs her son before he gets to the road. As the mother grabs her son, the ball gets run over by a car, splat. What is the boy thinking right now? My mum has betrayed me. That ball was everything to him. It was his obsession, and now it's gone. And my mum, the person who is meant to look after me, has taken away the most important object in my life. But of course we know this couldn't be further from the truth. The mother has just saved the boy's life. You see, the gap in understanding between the mother and the boy is huge. The boy simply isn't able to understand why the mother did this. And the mother is prepared to risk her son being angry at her if it's going to save his life. And if that is the gap in understanding between a child and an adult, how much more so is the gap in understanding between finite human beings and an infinite God? We have a finite, limited perspective. We cannot always understand the bigger picture the way our Father in heaven can. Approach number 2 can be best summarized by a rabbinical saying documented in the Talmud: Lefum tsara agra, according to the effort is the reward. There can be no doubt that in life growth only occurs through challenge and difficulty. We don't grow when we are in our comfort zone. If you want to build muscle, you have to put your body through physical exertion. And if you want to build a relationship, you have to put in the effort. And when people go through difficult challenges in life, be it health issues, financial troubles, or bereavement, one thing is for sure: they become people of substance. Challenges force us to confront our biggest defects and decide whether we want to build our moral character. This is not something God can give to us. It is something only we can do ourselves. Suffering also creates a vulnerability in relationships, with ourselves, with others, and with God, that can often provide a channel to bring them to newfound heights. Suffering makes us vulnerable, and vulnerability helps us realize that we need others. And so we connect with one another, we give to one another, and we grow. The third approach is to recognize a simple truth: life is temporary. No matter how painful suffering can become, one thing is guaranteed: it all ends at some point. We are all finite. We all die. The question then is this life all there is? If this life is all we have, then I would be much more troubled by the idea that God is a loving being. But if this world is merely a temporary journey that takes us to an infinite end, a place where we enjoy the fruits of the growth we have achieved in this temporary world, then that changes everything. The most compelling source of hope for human beings going through suffering is the saying attributed to King Solomon: "This too shall pass." If this temporary world will transition to a place of true peace and ultimate justice, then one can handle almost anything. Finally, number 4. The truth is, we are far better off being troubled by the question of suffering. For if we had an explanation, then we would make peace with suffering, and that misses the whole point. Imagine you're in a hospital and you hear a woman screaming with pain. Outside her room, her family is standing around, chatting and smiling and happy. You scream at them, "What's wrong with you? Can't you hear how much pain she's in?" They answer, "This is the delivery ward. She's having a baby, of course we're happy." You see, when you have an explanation of pain, it suddenly doesn't seem so bad anymore. But as long as the pain of innocence remains a burning question, we are bothered by its existence and moved to do something about it. We are not expected to or meant to understand suffering in this world ultimately. We cannot have all the answers, but we can choose how to respond. You know, in most religions, the question of suffering is typically asked by the heretics. But in Judaism, our leaders ask the question. Abraham was chosen by God instead of Noah, because Abraham challenged God when he said he would destroy Sodom, whereas Noah accepted the world's predicament that there would be a flood without putting up much of a fight. Noah accepted, Abraham protested. Our leaders are praised for asking the question, why God, why? For as long as we cannot explain pain, we are responsible to do our best to alleviate it. And by asking the question, we are forced to look for answers and ultimately become a force for good.
Of all the religions in the world, Judaism is the only one to make a claim that God revealed himself to an entire people, 3 million. Of the 15,000 religions documented in human history, only Judaism makes such a claim. But it's not only this. No other religion other than Judaism makes the claim that God revealed himself with even just one witness, let alone 3 million. Why? Surely by saying that your ancestors all experienced God together is far more persuasive than saying that one person did without any witnesses to verify the experience. Why does no other religion other than Judaism make a claim of God revealing himself to a group, as opposed to just one person? Whether it be Guru Nanak's divine journeys and Sikhism, Siddhartha Gautama's enlightened state of being, Muhammad's vision in the cave, Joseph Smith in the forest, or St. Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, they all claim to have heard God tell them that they were the chosen one to deliver God's message when they were alone. They then spent their lives convincing others that God had actually spoken the true gospel to them. It's worth noting, by the way, that the famous Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, does also make a claim of mass revelation. At the Battle of Bhagavad Gita, they have a tradition that their chief god descended to 3 million people and spoke to them. Except, unlike the Jewish national revelation, everyone permanently dies during the revelation. So how do they have the tradition of this story occurring? Because they say that their God told the story to one person, and he spread it. Thus, this has the same level of validity, or lack of validity, as other religious claims of private revelation. True, it is claimed that Jesus performed miracles in public, but this is not a revelation of God. Even today, there exist people who can do seemingly unexplainable magic tricks. But even if these miracles actually did occur, Judaism, among all of the world's major religions, attributes no significance whatsoever to people performing miracles or claims of such things occurring as a basis for belief in a religion. As Maimonides, the medieval scholar, explains, this is not a good enough reason to believe in something. This explains why Moses protested that he needed something more weighty than him just performing miracles. Maimonides writes, quote, "The Jews did not believe in Moses, our teacher, because of the miracles that he performed. What then was the basis of their belief? The revelation at Mount Sinai, which we saw with our own eyes and heard with our own ears, not having to depend on the testimony of others. And therefore it says, face to face, God spoke with you, the Jewish people." As a side point, the Torah even says that if someone comes along and performs some miracles and then says that the Torah should be changed and they should follow his or her path, one should not believe such a person. The Torah says, quote, "If there should stand up in your midst a prophet or a dreamer of a dream, and he will produce to you a sign or a wonder, and the signs or the wonder comes about, if he spoke to you, saying, let us follow gods of others that you did not know, and we shall worship them. Do not hearken to the words of that prophet, or to that dreamer of a dream, for Hashem your God is testing you, to know whether you love God with all your heart and with all your soul." So back to our question. Why does no other religion other than Judaism make a claim of God revealing himself with a group of people, as opposed to just one? Because this is one lie you can never get away with. How can we determine whether an event in human existence is history or legend? A legend is not something one can verify because there are no witnesses. History is verifiable because there are witnesses. For example, the legend of King Arthur and the sword in the stone is a legend. It may or may not be true. We will never know. The Battle of Hastings, on the other hand, is verifiable because there were many eyewitnesses. And the rule is exactly the same when it comes to divine revelation. If somebody claims that, quote, God spoke to me, people can choose whether or not to believe the claim. Most religions have started this way. But if someone claims that God spoke to all of you, he can never get away with such a claim if it did not occur. If an event never happened to somebody, it is surely impossible to convince that person that it happened to them. Furthermore, the Torah says that God did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, who are all here alive today. Let's imagine that the Torah was actually man-made by Moses, and he was going to pull off the greatest hoax ever. Imagine Moses goes up the mountain, he then comes back down and tells the people that he was being taught something called the Torah by God himself. Now Moses doesn't want to tell them that he really made it all up, so he tells them that God gave it to all of us. Remember? 40 days ago, there was this magnificent revelation where God spoke to us all. It says so right here in this Torah. Obviously, the people would not believe this. They would tell Moses, "We never experienced God speaking to 3 million of us. That's absurd." You cannot get away with the claim of national revelation if it isn't true. Moses cannot tell them that God spoke to them if it didn't happen. Now let's consider the possibility that the claim of national revelation of God was expressed at a later date in history, as Bible critics often claim. Let's say that the Torah was actually written by the Jewish leader Ezra 1,000 years after the Sinai event was claimed to have occurred. So it's 400 BCE, Ezra writes the Torah, in particular the part about national revelation, and then he walks into a synagogue and he says, "Hello everyone, gather round, I have here a Torah. It contains God's instructions to us." Where did this come from? The people would ask. Ezra would respond, well, 1,000 years ago, the Jewish nation were at Mount Sinai and they heard God speaking to them. The people would reply by saying, "We have never heard of such a story. Why haven't we heard of this before?" Well, it was a long time ago, Ezra would say, but the people would then say, surely at least someone would have mentioned it over the years to us. Maybe one of our grandparents or great-grandparents. Surely such a unique and unprecedented event would have been passed down to us? Ezra would then say, look, sometimes people forget things, all right? So God spoke to 3 million people at once and everybody forgot about such an event, the people would explain. Yes, it sounds far-fetched, but that's what happened, Ezra would say. However, there is just one problem with this. The Torah clearly states that, quote, "This song shall testify for them like a witness, because lo yamushu mipicha, it will never be forgotten by the mouths of their descendants." Ezra's argument to them is therefore void. He told them their ancestors collectively experienced God at Mount Sinai 1,000 years ago, and that they all forgot about it. But the Torah says, you will never forget it. Because the Torah says this, at no point in Jewish history would it have been possible for such a forgery to have occurred. It seems obvious that the author wrote this verse to prevent such a counterattack. No other religion has made the claim of God revealing himself with even just one witness, let alone 3 million. Because this is the one claim you cannot get away with if it's false. You can say you had a private revelation of God and people can choose whether or not to believe you, but you cannot get away with a false claim of national revelation. Legends do not require witnesses, history does. This is why no other religion has been able to make such a claim that the Torah does. And it is the basis for Jewish belief in God and the Torah. This is why in the Shema, that famous declaration of belief in one God, the letter ayin in the word Shema and the letter daled at the end of the word echad are written far bigger than the other letters, because when put together they spell aid, meaning witness. The idea is that the Jewish people collectively witnessed God at Mount Sinai, and that is the rational basis for our belief. Finally, not only is the Jewish claim of national revelation unique, but the Torah even appears to suggest that such a claim will never be repeated again in human history. The Torah says, "You might inquire about times long past, from the day that God created man on earth, exploring one end of heaven to the other. Has there ever been anything like this great thing, or has anything like it been heard? Has a people ever heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you have heard, and survived?" This is a remarkable statement. The Torah is suggesting that not only will there not be another national revelation again, but that nobody will even attempt to make such a claim. How could the author know this? Let's imagine that the Torah was written by a human author pretending to be God. Why should the author predict that no other nation would make such a claim of national revelation? Surely that person would know more than anyone else that it is possible to fabricate such a claim. The only kind of being that could make such a claim would be one that had foreknowledge of all of world history. and we all know who that is. This is why no other religion has made such a claim of national revelation like the Jewish people. And this is also why the two main monotheistic offshoots from Judaism, Christianity and Islam, do not deny the Torah's divine authenticity or its claim of national revelation. They merely claim that their later prophets, or messiahs, taught that the laws needed to be updated. Surely it would have made more sense for them to deny that the revelation ever occurred. The answer is that its authenticity is very hard to deny. One will notice that many of the Jewish mitzvot, the commandments, such as sanctifying the Sabbath with Kiddush, or our prayers, or wearing tefillin, they are all filled with references to Yetziat Mitzrayim, the leaving of Egypt, and the national revelation of God at Mount Sinai. Why? Because it is the basis of Jewish belief in the divine authorship of the Torah. The claim of national revelation sets Judaism apart from all other religious claims of revelation. It is logical to think that if God created the world and has a purpose for humanity, he would have revealed his instructions in a historically verifiable manner. This has been a foundational basis for Jewish belief throughout the centuries. As it says in the Torah, "Do not remove this memory from your heart all the days of your life. Teach your children and your children's children about the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb." I'm Ollie Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV. I believe in science, not God. If I had a coin for every time I heard someone say that to me, then I'd probably have 4, 5 coins. Anyway, is it really true that belief in God and science conflict? There are two questions we have to deal with in science when it comes to considering whether the existence of God is plausible. The first is creation. Essentially, how did the universe come to exist in the first place? We have two options here. Either the universe is infinite, it has always existed without a beginning, or it is finite, it came into existence at a certain point. If the universe is infinite, it does not require a creator because it was always there. This theory was prevalent in the ancient world, but since the 1960s, the scientific world has found strong evidence that the universe had a beginning, what we call the Big Bang. Now, if the universe is finite, if it had a beginning, it would require something beyond the universe to create it. The logic is simple. Everything in the universe is based on cause and effect, and therefore if the universe began, it is the effect, and therefore must have had a cause. Now, what would this cause look like? Well, it follows logic that since this cause is outside of the universe, and thus outside of space, it would have to be spaceless and immaterial. Since it's outside of the universe, and thus outside of time, it would have to be timeless. And in order to cause the universe to exist, it would need to have unfathomable power. A timeless, spaceless, immensely powerful force. Does this sound like something contradictory to the monotheistic concept of an infinite God? Today, it is actually the atheists who have a greater burden of proof, not the monotheists. The monotheistic position does not inherently contradict science if the universe is finite. So what do the atheists say now with regard to the creation of the universe? Well, the best idea that they have come up with is to posit that it is possible for something to come from nothing, as argued in Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing. He argues that just because the universe had a beginning, it doesn't necessarily have to require a cause. David Albert, professor of philosophy and director of the MA program in the Philosophical Foundations of Physics at Columbia University, reviewed Krauss's book and destroyed the basis of the argument. What Krauss described as nothing, quantum fluctuations, Albert explained, was something, and therefore the whole argument that the universe came from nothing did not stand. The second question with regard to science and God is about design. How is it that the universe is so finely tuned for life and so complex in its nature? We also, again, have two options here. Either it all happened by accident, or it was designed by an intelligent designer. The unbelievable intricacy, beauty, and constants that permit the universe and life to exist seems to suggest to us that you need a designer. To put the 19th century theologian William Paley's example in modern terms, imagine you were to stumble on an iPhone in the desert. you would recognise that its complex nature must have been designed by someone. To suggest that it came into its current form in a random process which was not guided by an intelligent designer would be absurd. So how much more so should we apply this to the universe? By the mid-1970s, scientists began to recognise something known as the anthropic principle, which is that the universe doesn't just happen to be suitable for human life, it seems to be set up that way. The universe exists within what scientists have called the Goldilocks zone. Different constants are just right for life to exist. If they were just slightly different, life would not be possible. Some examples. Number 1, the distance of planet Earth to the Sun. Not too far, not too close. If it was one or the other, we would be extinct. Number 2, the way the Earth spins on its axis, providing seasons. Number 3, the unique properties of such a simple molecule as water. For example, in warming weather, chunks of ice float rather than sink to the bottom of a lake, where they might melt extremely slowly. This doesn't happen with other liquid molecules. These properties therefore allow aquatic life in the lake to survive during the winter. Sir Fred Hoyle, who was an atheist, said that, quote, "a common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super-intellect has monkeyed with the physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. The incredible design, structure, and fine-tuning of the universe as a whole therefore indicates that there is an intelligent source which designed it." So what do the atheists say to this? Now, it's important to recognise that today the debate is not between scientists and religion. It is between the scientists, those who are theists in some capacity and those who are not. Today, the atheists say that the design of the universe is remarkable, but maybe there are an infinite amount of universes that exist, and we just happen to be living in the one with all the right constants. This is known as the multiverse concept. So, what is their evidence of this? Nothing. By definition, the multiverse is not provable, as we cannot escape the dimensions of our own universe. Bernard Carr of Queen Mary University said, quote, "If you don't want God, you better have a multiverse." Isn't it ironic that the atheists are relying on nothing evidence-based here? So who exactly are the ones with the blind faith? George Ellis, a famous cosmologist, wrote an article which featured on the front page of Scientific America, where he said, quote, "The trouble is that no possible astronomical observations can ever see those other universes. The arguments are indirect at best. And even if the multiverse exists, it leaves the deep mysteries of nature unexplained." A specific question in the issue of fine-tuning is how living things, animals and human beings, came to be. Darwin's theory of evolution, though logically coherent, has two fundamental questions which remain unanswered. The first is the question of how that first original living cell came into being in the first place. Darwin believed that it emerged from the inorganic earth. But as Freeman Dyson pointed out, quote, "There is an enormous gap between the simplest living cell and the most complicated naturally occurring mixture of non-living chemicals. We have no idea when and how and where this gap was crossed. The first living cell would have had to contain DNA, something which, as Bill Gates put it, is, quote, like a computer program, only much more complex than anything we've been able to design." Francis Crick, the man who discovered DNA, said, quote, "An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense, the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going." And Dr. George Whitesides, an organic chemist from Harvard University, with the highest Hirsch index rating of any living chemist, wrote on this topic, quote, "How? I have no idea. Based on all the chemistry, I know it seems astonishingly improbable. Today there is still no proven way how an organism with DNA, no matter how simple, could have emerged from an inanimate element if guided by nature alone." The second most notable issue with the theory of evolution is that it is extremely unlikely for it to have occurred by chance. Sir Fred Hoyle wrote that, quote, "The chance that higher life forms might have emerged by chance is comparable to the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. John Barrow, research professor of mathematical sciences at the University of Cambridge, and Frank Tipler, a physicist, cosmologist and mathematician at Tulane University, calculated the probability of the evolution of the human genome to be essentially impossible. The questions around evolution, both how it begun and its likelihood of producing life, don't necessarily destroy the legitimacy of the theory, but there remain unanswered questions. And at this stage, you would need to believe that it did not happen by chance, but that it was a guided process. So to claim that evolutionary theory necessarily negates the need for an intelligent designer is simply wrong. These points, among others, led evolutionary professor at the University of Cambridge, Simon Conway Morris, to say that, quote, atheism is dead. Could it be that science is gradually coming to recognize the necessity of the world having a creator and a designer, of there being a God? You may argue that science doesn't necessarily indicate that there must be an intelligent designer and creator. You can say we just don't have all the answers at this stage. But to claim that science necessarily negates the existence of God is simply untenable. I'm Ollie Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV. Nearly all religions out there have a concept of heaven, that while our life in this world is temporary, our souls will go on to live an afterlife for an eternity. And if you ask most Jewish people, I assume most of them would tell you that Judaism is included in this. However, to anyone who pays close enough attention, how many times do you think the Hebrew Bible, that is, the 5 books of Moses, discusses the afterlife, heaven? You'll be shocked. The answer is a whopping great 0. Yes, that's right, the most famous of all religious books, the founding document of ethical monotheism, does not mention the afterlife once. I'll give you a moment while you recompose yourself. Pretty remarkable, eh? But the question becomes more interesting when you look at the endless Jewish commentaries from the rabbis of the Talmud to the modern era, whom all seem to believe in the next world, what they call Olam Haba. So where do they get their source for this if it's not mentioned in the Torah, the ultimate guide to what Jews are meant to believe in, right? Many answers have been offered to this question by Jewish scholars. One opinion given by the medieval scholar the Ramban is that the Torah discusses spirituality actually all over the place. It talks about God, divine miracles, that we have souls, and he says that it's self-evident from the Torah that there is clearly a realm that exists outside the physical one. Another opinion is that the focus on heaven would belittle the importance of this world, making the most of the blessings of this world and achieving our potential here and now. And we know all too well what happens when a religion focuses too much on the paradise of the world to come. It ends up coming at the expense of valuing life here on earth. But I want to share with you an answer to this question given by Maimonides, the Rambam, another medieval Jewish scholar, which I find particularly moving. He says that the Torah is a book of obligations, and if the Torah started discussing the reward of the afterlife, then it would end up obliging us to serve God with the intention of receiving reward in the afterlife, and that misses the whole point. Life according to Torah is about human beings building a loving relationship with God. The Torah is like our marriage document, or in Hebrew our ketubah, with God. In a ketubah, a marriage document, it lists the obligations that the partners have to one another. Imagine if the document said in it, "Be kind to him so that he will make you breakfast in the mornings." How unromantic. Each marriage partner can know that of course their lives are going to be more pleasant if they give to one another, but to codify it into the marriage document that they should give to each other in order to get something in return, that misses the whole point. That's not love. Yes, a true loving relationship can start from people giving out of their own self-interest, but the ideal is for it to get to a place where each partner gives to the other simply because they love them. And likewise in our relationship with God. Ideally, we're not meant to be thinking about what's in it for us, what reward we can get, because that's not love. The Torah wants us to get to a place of love with God, not selfishness, where we're focused on the reward of the next world. I'm going to do that commandment so that I get rewarded by God. I'm going to add some brownie points. for what I can get in heaven. So we certainly can know there's reward. Indeed, the oral Torah passed down through the generations speaks all over the place about the next world. But to write it into the written Torah, to codify it into the marriage document, that misses the essence of true love. Ironically, the greatest pleasure in relationships that we can experience in life isn't when we focus on what we can get in return, but rather when that's the furthest thing from our mind. I'm Ollie Annisfeld, and you're watching JTV.
It was love at first sight. I'm sure you've heard someone say those words after they met someone on a night out. They'll tell you all about the moment they caught the eye of the person and they just fell in love. But let's take a step back and unpack this phrase for a moment. Love at first sight suggests something quite bold. It implies that love just happens. We don't choose it. It just happens when we meet the right person at the right time. It suggests that love takes no conscious effort on our part and is merely a spontaneous feeling that is generated out of thin air. Love at first sight means someone takes a glance at a person, knowing nothing about them other than how they look, and somehow now loves that person. Is that really love? At least according to the Jewish understanding, this isn't really love at all. This is infatuation. I think love is a confused concept in the world today. Consider the lyrics to Ed Sheeran's song Shape of You. I'm in love with your body, I'm in love with the shape of you. I'm in love with your body, with the shape of you. We sing and dance to it aimlessly, but these words are an even more open admission that our love is literally about the way someone looks, the shape of their body. The Torah's definition of love is very different. Love is the feeling of deeply appreciating the virtues in someone, generated by giving of yourself to them. The Torah describes the love of Adam and Eve as knowledge. Their love was based on an appreciation of their inner being, not merely their physical looks. When infatuated people use the word love, they are using it in the same way they describe their love of burgers or shopping. They focus purely on the physical attractiveness of the other person in order to satisfy their own desires. It is all about what can I get from this relationship. It is about love of oneself. Love, according to Torah, is about appreciating the other, giving to the other, and moving beyond your own wants, the complete opposite of infatuation. We see this illustrated most vividly in the following example. Teenage boys are more than happy to discuss their female friends purely from the perspective of how good looking they are. However, I can guarantee you that if one of those boys overheard someone describing their sister with such language, he would probably be willing to take up arms against the other person speaking. Why? Because he loves his sister. He knows her well and appreciates her qualities and her value. Yes, being attracted to someone, physical attraction is natural and important. We shouldn't belittle it. But at the same time, to purely discuss someone in those terms, to hear of someone close to you, to be degraded to a piece of meat to look at, and to be degraded to one's own ends, that's difficult to hear. And yet the same boy will happily continue to discuss other females in such a way. This vividly illustrates the difference between love and infatuation. Infatuation is about me. Love is about appreciating the other. The word for love in Hebrew is ahava. The middle two letters spell hav, which means to give in Aramaic. The more you give to a person, the more you love a person, and the more you appreciate the good virtues within them. We also often hear the term that love is blind. In other words, love is when you overlook certain negative traits of a person because you are in love. But according to the Jewish definition, this is also a falsehood. Love is a deep appreciation of who someone really is. Who loves you more than anyone else in the world? The people who have given to you the most. This is most likely to be your parents. But who knows your faults better than anyone else in the world? Your parents. Love isn't blind. Love is a magnifying glass. Infatuation is blind. Gila Manelson, a Jewish author and a relationships counsellor, shared a story of a woman who came to her after a few years of marriage. She told her that she no longer felt she was right for her husband. She explained that she didn't feel he was, quote, smart enough,
Mrs. Mandelson was shocked. I can work out whether someone is intelligent within 2 minutes. How is it that it has taken you 2 years to figure this out? She asked the lady. It turned out that the couple had been intimate from very early stages in the relationship, and her infatuation towards her partner blinded her from some of the basic attributes she was looking for in her husband. Real love is about appreciating who someone really is. Infatuation is about covering it up because of one's own physical attraction. Mrs. Mandelson went on to say that one should be very, very wary when they describe their boyfriend or girlfriend as perfect. No one is perfect. And someone who thinks their boyfriend or girlfriend is, should see this as a clear warning sign of maybe being infatuated. That is why the Torah says that Isaac got married and then he loved her, in that order. At the beginning of any relationship, the love is at its weakest, because both partners are, at least in part, acting in their own interests. But through the process of building the relationship and appreciating the other's qualities, the love can grow. Thus, Isaac actively loved her once he was married. Through investing effort in giving to the other, the love grows. Without this effort, it stays still and eventually declines. It is no accident that God designed human beings in a way that they become, frankly, less physically attractive as they get old. Physical attraction is an important part of marriage, but it's only the means through which a deeper and less superficial love for one another can develop. As the relationship is built, the physical part is meant to gradually become less important, as the appreciation of each other's inner being and soul becomes manifest. Western society has confused love with infatuation, so most people see marriage as the slow deterioration of the romance that first kindled the relationship, which may contribute in part towards the higher rate of divorce in many countries today. But the Jewish view is the opposite. Love is in our hands. Love has the capacity to grow and grow. Love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice. From a young age, I was taught in school the famous phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me." In other words, physical pain is real and tangible, but don't be fazed by words. They're not physically damaging any part of you, are they? It was only later in life that I learned that Judaism wholly rejects this way of thinking. It says in Proverbs, "Life and death are in the hands of the tongue." Words have immense power because we are human beings with emotional needs. Our words reflect the way we think about a person, and hurtful words can damage our self-worth. You rarely hear of someone committing suicide because of their physical pain, but you regularly hear of people committing suicide because of emotional pain. Wounds can heal, but actually sometimes words can't. I'm sure you can think of a time that someone said something to you and it really affected you in a negative way. And the irony is that the person saying it probably doesn't even realize to this day the impact they have had. Two women were on a bus in Israel discussing the recent engagement of their old school friend. "I can't believe she's engaged. Do you remember when she had that mental breakdown, when she was 11 years old? I thought she would never see the light of day after that," said one of them. As the women were deep in conversation, one of the older passengers turned to both of them and said, "You know, the woman who you're talking about, well, my grandson is the one that's engaged to her. I want to thank you for sharing this information with me, so I can now warn him." Shocked at what they had just done, the two women instantly started backtracking. No. What we were saying was complete nonsense. She is really such a lovely person, and we were exaggerating. In fact, she was only out of school for 2 weeks, and the whole idea of her having a mental breakdown were just rumours." The old lady kept insisting that they were speaking the truth initially. The two women were beside themselves, deeply aware of the tragedy their words had engineered. As the old lady was ready to get off at her stop, she turned to them and said, "I must tell you, he's not actually my grandson, but imagine if he was." Our words are very, very powerful. Hurtful words, speaking badly about others, is called lashon hara in Hebrew. And there are many rules that Jewish law demands of us to abide by regarding how we speak to and about others. But while this power can be used for bad, what we say can also be used for good. A few complimentary words can hugely uplift a person. Isn't it a shame that the time we make the biggest effort to find good things to say about someone is at the time of their death? Imagine what a better world this would be if we did this to other people while they were still alive. In Genesis, we see God creates the world with words. Words create the world. Words can create worlds. They have immense power. Lashon hara is a very damaging way in which words are used. But on the flip side, words can be used for the good. A single compliment can change someone's day, even someone's life. I'm Ollie Anisfeld, and you're watching JTV.
To stay up to date with the latest JTV content, if you're on YouTube, click subscribe below the video and the alarm bell. And if you're on Facebook, click the like button, and under following, click see first.